Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Ollie Barrett, live from London, and these are the headlines. UK unemployment falls to a 48-year low, but most workers face rapidly falling living standards as wages fall behind inflation. Ukrainian authorities say a rescue mission to extract the last defenders of the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol is underway after hundreds of soldiers left in an earlier operation. In a tit-for-tat move, Russia expels 2 diplomats from the Finnish embassy in Moscow in retaliation against Helsinki's decision to expel 2 of its diplomats. Counting in the Lebanon polls suggests the Iran-backed Hezbollah group and its allies have lost their parliamentary majority, while reformist candidates make gains. Clashes rock Libya's capital Tripoli as the parliament-appointed Prime Minister tries to take control of government from a rival administration that has refused to cede power. And Elon Musk says spam account doubts could yet scuttle his Twitter purchase unless Twitter shows proof that spam bots account for under 5% of total users. We'll start in the United Kingdom, where the unemployment rate has fallen to 3.7% in the first 3 months of this year. That is the lowest level since 1974. Job vacancies have also hit a fresh high, but soaring inflation has led to the biggest annual fall in real earnings for most workers since 2013. And the Bank of England has warned of a potentially apocalyptic rise in food prices for the UK. Let's talk to our correspondent Giles Gibson now, who's joining me live from London. And Giles, this is an interesting mix of data for the UK economy. Good news and bad news in there.
Yeah, Ollie, mixed is just the exactly correct word in terms of looking at this data, in terms of how the UK economy is faring right now. Because on the one hand, we have some of the lowest unemployment figures seen since the mid or the early 1970s. You know, you've got 1.3 million job vacancies out there and just not enough workers to go out there and actually fill them. But on the other hand, you have just the inflation coming off the back of the war in Ukraine, as well as the recovery from the coronavirus crisis, just dragging down a lot of these figures and a lot of the sentiments, the business sentiment here in the UK. So in the first quarter, we saw wages here in the UK rising by 4.2%. That would normally be a very healthy figure. But if you combine that with the fact that inflation was at 7%, then you effectively have a situation where people are just feeling poorer and poorer. They are just feeling like they have less money in their pockets for every month that goes by. Meanwhile, we are also expecting to get the next set of inflation figures, the official figures from the government on Wednesday. We are expecting to see inflation at around about 9%, so even higher than what we've seen in the first quarter. And the Bank of England has also recently warned that we could see inflation going into double figures, going as high as 10% over the course of the year, as these sort of shock, these effects from the Ukraine war, the Ukraine crisis, just keep battering away at economies here in Europe.
Well, Giles, you mentioned some of those pretty stark comments from the Bank of England yesterday, and the opposition Labour Party in the UK pushing the so-called cost of living crisis at Parliament today.
Yeah, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, was testifying in front of a committee in Parliament, and he made just headline after headline in terms of his assessment of how the UK economy is faring right now, describing the rises in food prices that we're seeing here in the UK and around the world as apocalyptic. He also said that this current environment, this current crisis, is really the toughest challenge that the Bank of England has faced since it was given its independence by the Tony Blair government, the Labour government back in the late 90s. As he mentioned, we're also expecting to see Labour pushing for a vote in Parliament on what's known as a windfall tax on North Sea oil companies, North Sea energy companies, who of course are seeing their profits absolutely skyrocketing as energy prices go up across the UK and across Europe. Generally speaking, the Conservatives are ideologically opposed to this idea of a windfall tax. Their theory generally is that if you start taxing companies when they're making profits, then you are discouraging them from investing here in the United Kingdom because they could face, more taxes down the road. There are some signs that some backbench Tory MPs would be prepared to support a windfall tax, the idea basically being that you are taking money that these companies are making in profits and somehow diverting it to people who are really struggling with their energy bills at the moment. But at this stage, it looks like the Labour Party are going to be unlikely to succeed in terms of getting a vote in Parliament on this issue. So this appears to be more of a sort of tactical or a symbolic move from the opposition Labour Party.
OK, Giles, thank you. Stay where you are for the time being, because the British Foreign Minister is setting out today the UK's plans for legislation and its strategy on changing the post-Brexit trade deal for Northern Ireland. Liz Truss is not introducing any new law this week, but is telling Parliament what that legislation will look like. She's expected to take to her feet in the House of Commons in the coming minutes. Boris Johnson says that the government needs an insurance option to be able to override some of the post-Brexit rules for the province if the European Union won't agree to changes. And back to you, Giles. As I say, Liz Truss expected on her feet in the next few minutes in the House of Commons. As we speak, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is facing questions from MPs on some of the issues we were talking about previously. But what do we expect Liz Truss to say?
Ollie, I think we're going to get sort of a broad strokes, sort of a 30,000 foot view of what this legislation could look like. So we could, for example, see Liz Truss outlining this legislation that would effectively take away some of the customs checks for goods flowing into Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. We could also see her making some sort of statement about the European Court of Justice, the UK potentially moving to sort of strip away its oversight role as part of this legislation that they are proposing. I think just really worth underlining once again that this is not going to be Liz Truss officially tabling this legislation in the UK Parliament. We are just going to see some broad strokes really about what it could actually be. We don't really expect the UK government now to actually table this legislation until sort of the start of July, the start of June rather at the earliest. What this allows the UK government to do really is to keep sort of moving on these two tracks. So on the one hand, they can keep negotiating with the EU, looking for what are described as technical fixes to some of the issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and on the other hand, they can keep moving forward this legislation through Parliament, get through some of those legislative hoops, and then get it to the point where it is a weapon that they can use in this dispute. I think it's also going to be really interesting to see how the EU responds, if at all, because, will they keep their powder dry? Will they sort of hold back while this legislation has not actually been proposed? Or will we see some sort of strong statement coming out of Brussels and the European Commission in the wake of Liz Truss speaking in Parliament in the next few minutes or so?
OK, Giles, thank you. Next, Sweden's foreign minister has signed an application declaring the country does want to join NATO. Sweden and Finland need all of the military alliance's 30 members to approve their applications. For now, Turkey says it is against the Nordic countries joining the alliance. The Turkish president has asked Finland and Sweden not to bother sending delegates to Ankara.
President of the Republic of Turkey, değerli konuklar, şimdi sizlere hitap etmek üzere Cumhurbaşkanımız Sayın...
Pazartesi günü Türkiye'ye geleceklermiş. Ya bizi ikna etmeye mi gelecekler? Kusura bakmasınlar. Yorulmasınlar. Her şeyden önce Türkiye'ye yaptırım uygulayanların bu süreç içerisinde bir güvenlik örgütü olan NATO'ya girmelerine biz evet demeyiz. Çünkü NATO o zaman bir güvenlik örgütü olmaktan çıkar, teröristlerin adeta temsilcilerinin yoğunlaştığı bir yer haline gelir.
Turkey wants Sweden and Finland to stop what it sees as support for Kurdish terrorist groups and wants export bans to be lifted. Sweden suspended arms sales to Turkey 3 years ago, following Ankara's military intervention in Syria. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he does not consider the expansion of NATO a threat, but has warned against the increase of military infrastructure in Sweden and Finland.
Что касается расширения Североатлантического альянса, да, это проблема, которая создается, на мой взгляд, совершенно искусственно, поскольку делается это в интересах внешнеполитических интересах Соединенных Штатов. Вообще НАТО используется как инструмент внешней политики, по сути, одной страны, но делается достаточно настойчиво, искусно и весьма агрессивно. Это все усугубляет и без того непростую международную обстановку в области безопасности.
Well, let's go live to Brussels now, where our correspondent Rosie Burchard is joining me now. Rosie, how do you think NATO is going to try and get past this current position being taken by Turkey on the issues of Sweden and Finland?
Well, dialogue really appears to be the only way ahead here. Now, Finnish President Sauli Niinistö is making an important state visit to Sweden today, and he has just been speaking to Swedish lawmakers. He said he is optimistic that Turkey will drop its opposition and that this NATO membership bid will be able to advance. But he also expressed some surprise around what he said was a hardening in Ankara's position over the last few days. He said in previous phone calls he'd held with Turkey, he had understood that Ankara was in fact on board with Finnish and Swedish NATO membership bids. Now, surprise is really the sense also here in Brussels, where NATO is headquartered. Ollie, in all the briefings I attended, there was a strong expectation that this would be a smooth and a swift accession process. This Turkish opposition was not expected, and just how they're going to overcome it in that dialogue, which will all, of course, be behind closed doors, is not yet known. We've heard from several ministers, for example, the Canadian foreign minister saying she's directly in touch with Turkey to try and smooth some of these bilateral issues, but when she addressed the press, she would not say exactly what kind of arguments she's using to try and convince Ankara. We've also heard from the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, that she is also in touch with Turkish counterparts, but the exact arguments not yet made public. We might see some sort of deal moving forward when it comes to amendments or drops of that arms embargo that you mentioned there, but that discussion will happen behind closed doors among NATO allies. Of course, Finland and Sweden have not yet submitted that formal NATO membership bid, but there is a concern about what might happen in the period between when they formally apply to the alliance and when they are formally becoming members, at which point those security guarantees that are associated with NATO membership kick in. In the meantime, there's a fear they could be subject to some sort of retaliation from Russia, particularly when it comes to cyber or disinformation. But there is not much fear here in Brussels, Ollie, that they will be subject to any sort of military retaliation, not least because Moscow is seen as having its hands very much tied in Ukraine.
Well, on that note, Rosie, you've got defence ministers in Brussels discussing further support for Ukraine. What form might that support take?
Those talks are happening as we speak, and the expectation is that they will be moving forward with a further 500 million euros in EU funding allocated for weapons deliveries to Ukraine. That's in addition to a 1.5 billion euro pot already set aside in EU funds. Now, it should be said that prior to the invasion of Ukraine, EU funds had never been used for lethal weapons purchases. This is a model where the EU allocates funds and then member states can bilaterally send weapons and then be reimbursed afterwards by Brussels. Now, more broadly, Ollie, what I'm hearing here in Brussels is that also countries are really trying to think about the longer term. They're fearing that this war may really drag on, and they're wondering what will this mean in terms of support for Ukraine in the months that may be coming in which this war drags on. One option they're thinking about is more training for Ukrainian forces. Could that, if they're going to be sending more weapons, more modern weaponry, for example, that might include training Ukrainian forces. Now, that is something that would not likely be happening through the Forum of the European Union, but either through an initiative set up by the United States at its Ramstein airbase in Germany, or through NATO, or through simple bilateral cooperation. But that is certainly something they are wondering about, how to draw out this support as this war drags on. Now, however, Ollie, there is one big type of support that Ukraine really wants, on which it doesn't have clarity yet, and that is a very clear path toward membership of the European Union. The Ukrainian Defence Minister Reznikov is joining these talks today by video conference, but he would very much like to be there as one of the member states of the European Union. That is something on which the EU has not given clarity yet. EU leaders are set to discuss this at a summit in June. What Ukraine wants is a very clear signal that it will become a candidate country, is something which is dividing EU nations and on which there is not any clear decision as of yet.
Rosie Barchard, live for us in Brussels. Thank you. Mariupol's massive Azovstal steel plant appears to be nearing an end when it comes to the occupation of it or otherwise. Hundreds of the remaining Ukrainian soldiers holding out in the facility were evacuated overnight. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has implied that some Ukrainians still remain inside the plant.
Щодо ситуації в Маріуполі, завдяки діям українських військових Збройних сил України, розвідки, перемовної групи, Міжнародного комітету Червоного Хреста і ООН, ми маємо надію, що вдасться зберегти життя наших хлопців. Серед них є важко поранені. Їм надається допомога. Хочу підкреслити, українські герої потрібні Україні живими. Це
Over 260 soldiers, many of them wounded, were evacuated through a humanitarian corridor to areas under the control of Moscow and Russia-backed separatists. According to Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, these soldiers could be exchanged for Russian prisoners of war. But Russia claims that Ukrainian soldiers at the steel plant surrendered themselves.
– 16 травня з Азовсталі до медичного закладу в Новоазовську евакуйовано 53 важкопоранених для надання медичної допомоги. Ще 211 осіб через гуманітарний коридор були доставлені в Оленівку.
Our correspondent Chris Jones has sent us this report from Riga.
Well, we've all seen the harrowing pictures, haven't we, of the besiegement of Mariupol and of the Azovstal steel plants. As you mentioned earlier, on Monday we saw a group of Ukrainian soldiers come out of the plants with a white flag and ask for negotiations. Now, those negotiations seem to have been completed. Around about 260 Ukrainian soldiers and around about 60 of those wounded have been taken to Russian-controlled towns now, where there will be be treated for their injuries. It's also believed that they will return back to the Ukrainian ranks in exchange for captured Russian soldiers. But President Volodymyr Zelensky is very clear that this is going to be a difficult and long process that's going to take delicacy and time. And of course, there are still people trapped inside the steel plants, and negotiations are ongoing to make sure that they are freed as quickly as possible too.
Lastly, we'll head to India, and Kashmir has witnessed record-breaking tourist footfall in the last decade. Hotels and houseboats are fully booked. Tourists are lining up for boat rides on the Dal Lake. Almost 1 million people have already visited the valley, and the numbers continue to rise. We will leave you with that report. Thanks for watching. Do stay tuned to WION. I'll be back at the same time tomorrow.
They call it paradise on earth. And why wouldn't you? Kashmir's legendary beauty is hard to explain in words. So just watch and admire. Before the insurgency, tourists would flock to Kashmir. Bollywood movies would inevitably be shot here. Now that buzz is back. According to the tourism department, 600,000 tourists visited the valley in the last 4 months. The numbers are the highest in the last 10 years. And with Amarnath Yatra starting in June, the government expects the numbers to grow further.
As you know that during the winter season, be it January to March, April, this has been a very good season. And even in April, if we see, figures have been quite good. And we had a tourist flow of more than 6 lakh tourists during first 4 months of this year, and we are expecting the way things are moving and tourist flow is going on. We must expect that this must be a very good tourism season and tourism year. And given the fact that Yatra is also happening, and that gives a good push to our tourism sector in Jammu and Kashmir overall and Kashmir particularly. And this time we will be welcoming tourists for Amarnath Ji Yatra, as well as to other tourist destinations, so that while they are on the pilgrimage affairs here, they shall also enjoy the other beauties at different locations of the valley.
The last 3 years were tough for the tourism industry. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the world to a standstill. Kashmir too incurred huge losses.
5 to 6 lakh tourists has already visited valley since from we can say from December, January last year, December, a couple of decades, maybe more than that during this period 5 to 6 lakh tourists have touched the valley. We are the promoters of this destination, so we are in this trade. So our message will be always people within the country, outside the country, who have visited already, come again and visit this paradise, and who have not visited. So our message is you must come once in your life at least to visit the valley.
Now is probably a good time to visit. Most of India is reeling under an intense heat wave. Here, temperatures are hovering around 20 degrees. Nippy but comfortable.
I have come earlier also. It was so beautiful. And I came in 2014 also and witnessed snowfall. Tulip Garden was so beautiful. I'm sure millions of people have come here and it looks much more developed now. It's a great place and everyone should come. Those who don't are missing out on something beautiful.
Beautiful place. It's very beautiful. From Dal to houseboats to shikaras, everything is beautiful. We are going to Gulmarg and Pahalgam. We can see a lot of people here and lots of relatives also visited. Everyone should come to the valley once.
Pretty soon the buzz will grow louder. because the next few months will kick off the Amarnath Yatra. The government is expecting 500,000 to 600,000 pilgrims this year.
Kashmir Valley has broken a 10-year-old record of tourist arrivals. According to Jammu and Kashmir's tourism department, more than 0.6 million tourists arrived in the Kashmir Valley in the last 4 months. And with Amarnath Yatra just around the corner, these numbers will further go up. With video journalist Feroz Idris Loan for WION World is One.
This is right, Arab.